ASMR Magical Tools. Hello, 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 hello. Welcome back. Welcome back, welcome back, welcome back. So today I'm going to be showing you how to cast for yourself a very basic 12 houses style geomantic spread. There is a previous video in which I have gone through all of the 16 geomantic figures, so you can watch that before you watch this video if you so desire. Some basic tools that you will need. You will need paper. You will need a writing implement. So of course I have chosen this dip pen. And you're going to need either 4 dice like these. They're just regular playing dice. Some board games have 2 sets of dice, and so if you have 2 different board games with 2 sets of dice, that will be easy to acquire. When I perform geomantic readings for myself, I use these stick dice. So if it lands with the flat side up, that is active and you will put 1 dot. And if it lands with the curved black side up, that would be passive and you put 2 dots. And these stick dice were used with ancient Egyptian board games like the game Senet. So that's how I got the idea for that, but you can actually buy geomantic, they call them geomantic dice, on Etsy. And they're flat, and one side will have 1 dot, and the other side will have 2 dots. So you can also purchase them if you choose to do so. There are some other methods for obtaining the figures, but I'm going to use the dice method today. We're just going to do something very basic that you could replicate for yourself at home. And of course, if I'm going to be casting a geomantic reading, I have to put on leather gloves, right? So, in order to get the figures, first of all, I'm going to go onto this piece of paper, and I'm just going to kind of draw out where my 12 houses are going to be. is that it's relying upon your existing understanding of the 12 houses. So, I do go over them in some of my other videos where I'm doing tarot readings and things like that. But I might make a video separately dedicated to the 12 houses, just to make sure that is clarified. So now, in order to fill the first 4 spaces on our 12 houses chart, so now in order to fill the first 4 spaces on our 12 houses chart, I'm going to roll these dice. And for odd numbers, I'm going to put 1 dot, and that's going to be an active line. And then for even numbers, I'm going to put 2 dots, and that is considered a passive line. So you just kind of roll them like this, and you want to have them kind of lined up. So we have even, 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 even. And we're going to put the figure populus here in the first house. And I guess I better make little asterisk so you guys can see. There. Now, to get the second house, we're going to roll again and line them up. So now we have 2 odd numbers here and 2 even numbers here. And we're going to put the figure of Fortuna Minor in the second house. And of course, going into a geomantic reading, you would have set an intention of what you would want to know from the reading, even if it was just something as general as, what can I expect to occur in the next 6 months for me? So now, we're moving on to the third house. And this time, we have the figure of Rubeus. So we have even, odd, even, even. And that's going to be in the third house. And we'll talk about what these figures in the different houses might mean. wish I had some pounce. That's kind of like a dust that you can use to absorb excess ink. I didn't think about that. And now the fourth. So here we have 3 odd, 1, 2, 3, and 1 even down at the bottom, which is the figure of Coda Draconis. Alright, and at this stage, you're then going to clear your dice out of the area, because the rest of the reading you're going to do by adding the points. So geomancy is also called way of the points. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the first line of each of these figures. So we have the first line of populace here. We have the first line of Fortuna Minor here. We have the first line of Rubeus here. And we have the first line of Cauda Draconis here. And that forms the figure of Acquisitio. So for the 6th house, we're going to take the second line. So the second line of Populus, the second line of Fortuna Minor, the second line of Rubeus, and the second line of Cauda Draconis. And that gives us the figure of Caput Draconis. And then again with the third line. So, right here with the 7th house. And that is the figure of Tristitia. And then finally, the 8th house. So, and we get Populus again. So this would be, I think, quincunx placement. It wouldn't be in opposition because the 1st and 7th houses are in opposition to each other. It would be more like a quincunx placement. So in order to fill the last 4 houses here, we're going to add together these 2 figures, these 2 figures, these 2, and then these 2. And the way that you do that is you add the first row of points and you get an odd number. And so you put 1 point there. You add the next 2 rows and you get another odd number. And then the last 2 rows you would get even numbers. And if you have populace and you're adding it to another figure, that other figure will always pass through that equation unchanged. So we have Fortuna Minor then as our result for that. Now we're going to add these 2. So Rubeus and Cauda Draconis. And we have an odd number. We have an even number. have an odd number. And then we have an even number. And that forms the figure of a missio. Now we're going to come over here and add acquisitio and caput draconis. So we have an even number. We have another even number because 1 plus 1 is 2. We have an odd number. And we have another even number. And that's going to form the figure of Albus. And then finally we're going to add 7 and 8, and because we know that 8 is populous up here, we're just going to go ahead and draw Tristitia again right here. Now, if you really want to, you can set up the courtroom in here with the left witness, the right witness, and the judge. And this can be used for clarification the same way that you would draw extra cards in a tarot reading if you wanted to get clarification. So the way these are derived is the left witness is derived from your 9th and 10th houses. So we have conjunctio there. And then the right witness. We have Fortuna Major. And then finally we'll put the judge right here. And that is going to be Acquisitio. So now that we've cast this chart, let's go over the possible meanings. So now I'm just going to use this side for pointing. So we have populace. We'll start over here in the first house, which is the house of self. And we have populace over here. We have populace over here in the 8th house as well. So it appearing twice, we can look at the correlation between the house of self, which is the first house, and the 8th house, which has to do with other people's possessions. It can have to do with inheritances, and it can also have to do with death. So, populace in the first house, you could have a lot of scattered thoughts. This is a figure of a lot of people coming together, so you could also have a lot of people crowding your headspace with their own opinions and thoughts this time, or lots of people coming to you for things. The 8th house can be multiple sources of income, and that all of the, so it would be like having a number of different accounts, and you would have to go and talk to each of those account holders separately to get your money from them. So this could have to do with your work. We're going to talk about this again in the 10th house, which is the house of career. The second house, we have Fortuna Minor. showing up again in the 9th house. So again, kind of a quincunx placement, not quite an opposition. And this is kind of important because if you do have a true opposition between two like figures, it can be that there's extra correlation there, but that if it is a quincunx placement instead, right, like what we're seeing here, and especially with a figure like Populus, there's further lack of focus in that situation because it's kind of off to the side, right? So here we're dealing with that again with Fortuna Minor, that there might be things that are kind of misdirected or off to the side or indirect related to this situation. So Fortuna Minor in the 2nd house is very good for finances. It does indicate that you do have a fair amount of material wealth. But because it is Fortuna Minor instead of Fortuna Major, we're also looking at situations where other people are having to help you out, or you're having to get a lot of help from other people in order to maintain this material wealth, right? So up here in the 9th house, we have Fortuna Minor, and this relates to travel. It relates to higher education, and it can also relate to matters having to do with clergy and the church, depending on what kind of religion you're affiliated with, right? So Fortuna Minor up here in the 9th house could be that you have a long trip, but that there are delays during this trip. It can be that you are studying at university, and you have to get a lot of help with your studies. So that's a possibility. And because we're seeing these two things here in the 2nd house with your finances and stability, and then up here with potential travel, it could be that you need to learn a language in order to better tap into these resources. It could also be that you're going to take a business trip, but that there are going to be some delays. But that trip would be to increase your finances and your stability. So now we're going to move on to the 3rd house. And in the 3rd house, we do have a malefic figure, which is Rubeus. So there are two figures that if you throw the dice and you get either one of these figures, and they are Rubeus and Cauda Draconis, which is actually here in the 4th house, that you should not continue the geomantic reading. You have to stop, you have to wait an hour. I also recommend looking at the planetary hours so I can go much more in depth in future videos as far as extra things that you can do to improve your geomantic readings, but I wanted to show you guys how to do them in a very basic sense so we can build from that knowledge. So Rubeus is an overturned chalice. It is the opposite of Albus, which we'll be talking about in the 11th house over here. And Rubeus is having to do with sinister and evil affairs. So the 3rd house is your surroundings. This would be like your neighborhood. It could have to do with siblings. It could have to do with communication coming in. So because we have Rubeus in the 3rd house, and then we come over here, and we have Cauda Draconis in the 4th house of home and family. The 4th house can also have to do with legacy related to the father, right? Because geomancy came around during a time when a lot of the wealth in families was passed down in a patrilineal So, because these two are right next to each other, this has to do with surroundings and siblings, and then this can have to do with your home and your father, potentially. There could be a lot of strife within your family at this time, or it could mean that the area where you live is very dangerous and that you need to leave. So cauda draconis also has to do with endings. Now, these are the main malefic figures in geomancy. We do have some less favorable figures that I'll talk about when we get to them, but these are the two main malefic figures. So, if you were doing this reading for yourself, and as I am doing this reading at a time when I know that we are going to need to find a new place to live soon, this resonates for me, certainly. So the next figure is Acquisitio, and Acquisitio is generally a very good figure to get in your readings because it has to do with increase of wealth. It represents a little money bag, right? Looks like a little bag full of money. And we have that echoed here in our courtroom, where the judge is also the sign of Acquisitio. So this could be the key to the whole situation, is this money that's going to be coming in for you. And the fifth house has to do with your passions. So that's creativity and romance. So, because Acquisitio is showing up here in the fifth house, that could be a creative endeavor that brings in money for you. And that, of course, would then make it possible to leave this situation. And it could be related to this trip that you might be taking to improve your financial stability. And there's the potential you would be working with other people, because we have, populace here, and multiple people paying you and having to kind of work with each and every single person to get your money. And then, this long trip that you might be taking. So all of those would be factors. And then, of course, we're going to talk about that again when we come to the 10th house. So the 6th house is health and daily routines, and we have cauda draconis here. So typically, I beg your pardon, we have caput draconis here. So this is the head of the dragon, and this is the tail of the dragon, okay? And this is typically a much more favorable figure, except in cases where you're talking about illness. So it could be that you begin an illness. It could also be that you begin a course of treatment or begin a new exercise or health regime or routine that greatly benefits you. So all of those things are possible here, but it could be the beginning of a health problem or a health solution. So that's going to be up to you. I thought we had caput draconis elsewhere in this reading, but I think I must have been mistaken. So now we're going to move on to the 7th house, which has to do with our partnerships. This is the house of other, and it's going to be in opposition to the house of self, right? The first house. So this has to do with your partnerships. It can have to do with legal cases, and it can also have to do with your open enemies, right? So in the 7th house here, we have the figure of Tristitia, and Tristitia is a figure of decrease and of depression and sadness. It looks like an arrow pointing down. So this isn't quite like a malefic like these two guys here, but it's very, it's still not a great figure to see in a reading. And where it is in the 7th house, you could end up losing a court case if you're involved with legal matters. It could also be that you have a breakup with a partner, either a romantic partner or a business partner. And of course, because it's in opposition to the 1st house, it could be because you are dealing with many more people. And so when you get more people involved, and especially when there's a lack of direction, like you might see with populace and with groups of people in general, it kind of, you get into this situation where there's too many cooks in the kitchen, so to speak, and it can lead to strife in relationships. If there is somebody who has been holding you back, however, and we're looking at this, if your question was about an open enemy, this would be very favorable for that question, because it would mean that that person was finally going to leave you alone. So we've already kind of talked about the 8th house here in relation to the 1st house, because we had that figure carried over into the 8th house, right? So we know that these situations might be related to one another. And likewise with the 9th house, where we saw that also quincunx to the 2nd, and we already kind of spoke on those matters as well. So now we can move into the 10th house, which has to do with career. So we have the figure of a missio here, and it's interesting that we have this figure here because it's the opposite of acquisitio, which we have here and here. So a missio is a figure of loss, but whereas tristitio is about like sadness and depression and general decrease, a missio is more like related to like material possession. You can see it's kind of like if you had a money bag and you turned it upside down, right, and all the money fell out. That's a missio. So it can be good if we're talking about illness. It could be about quitting or losing a job when we see it here in the 10th house. And it's possible at this time you are in a transition between careers, because here we see that the outcome is going to be more money coming in, but here we see that you're losing a job, right? So the potential being that you lose this job, but then you end up picking something up that is much more aligned with your true passions, right? So that's what we're seeing reflected here and here, because the figure from the 5th then is being carried over into what would be like the judge is kind of like the final outcome of the reading, okay? So let's move over to the 11th house. So this is important in relation to what we saw here with Fortuna Minor, okay? And the reason being that specifically with the figure of Fortuna Minor, we're looking at how other people are helping you. Fortuna Minor is kind of like, you would think of it like fast luck, as opposed to Fortuna Major, which we do also have here, which is a much more long-term good fortune and success. And Fortuna Minor is much more reliant on the people around you. It can also be a warning against lazy behaviors if it's showing up in your chart, but I don't necessarily think that's the case here, simply because we're seeing it here in the house of the elevation of the self, and we're seeing it in financial stability. We're not seeing it here, you know, in the 10th house. Like a lot of the other factors just tell me that there's something else going on at this time. So 11th house has to do with your social groups, your acquaintances, and also, you know, the direction of your fortune can be kind of indicated by the 11th house also. So the figure that we have here is Albus. And Albus is the opposite of Rubeus, which is down here in the 3rd house. So that is a trine placement. But in this particular case, I think that this just more indicates the kind of people that you're surrounding yourself with. And with Albus, it's kind of like the people that are around you. There's a lot of contemplation. There's a lot of moderation. Albus is a figure of moderation. It is Mercury in Gemini energy. So we're looking at situations where there might need to be a lot of thought and contemplation put into things. And because Albus is here, it can also be with that Mercury and Gemini energy, indicating the communication that you maintain within your friend groups, within and without your friend groups, basically. So down here, the 3rd house, which typically deals with communication, would be more dealing with your surroundings, because we're seeing these two figures together in a very specific way. And then up here in the 11th house, we're looking at the way that you communicate with the people around you, and that perhaps it's a good time to reach out to your friend group for help. And then finally in the 12th house, which is about endings, it can be about incarceration, because of course people cast geomantic spreads to find out about all kinds of things, and not just, not just the way we look at tarot, but people would use geomancy to find out specific things, like how their crops were going to do, or if the particular information in a book was factual or not, because of course, back in the Renaissance era, when geomancy really was in its heyday, there were not other ways to determine things like pregnancy, the biological sex of a baby, whether a book was factual or not, all of these kinds of things. Royalty is often dealt with up here in the 10th house. So if a king was going to die, you might get a figure there like Tristitia or Amisio, or even Cauda Draconis here. But so in the 12th house, we have the figure of Tristitia, right? And that is carried over from the 7th house. So that's another quincunx, that's another kind of misdirection placement. That's not quite as aligned as a opposition. And in this case, there might be a lot of things that you have to let go of in order to bring something to an end. And that things end just fine, but that there are things lost in the process. Or perhaps there's not a good sense of closure here. And I say that specifically with Tristitia just because it's more inclined toward these physiological, emotional responses like depression and sadness. So now let's talk about the courtroom, because we have some other figures here we haven't looked at yet. We have the left witness is Conjunctio. And Conjunctio is a figure of people coming together in partnerships. So you might be losing one partnership, but gaining another one. We have the right witness here is Fortuna Major, which is an incredibly favorable sign. So we have these two favorable signs here. And it's also related to coming together with other people. Not in the misdirected and abstract way that we see with populace. This would be more like a crowd. But this would be concerted efforts. So Conjunctio also is very similar to what we see in the 11th house, in that the figure of Conjunctio is Mercury in Virgo. So we have these two mercurial figures here that are very good for communication and for ideation. So working through problems with another person. And that's going to lead to this money coming in here. And it is going to have to do with your creative life. And because we're looking at your relationship to another person, it could be romance as well. So that is how you would read a geomantic chart for yourself. This is just the basics. And of course, I encourage you to watch the other video in which I go over all of the figures much more in depth and explain the correspondences. And you can kind of see for yourself how the connections are made while you're doing a reading. If you enjoyed this video, please do like, share, and subscribe. Your watching and your interactions are greatly appreciated. I love seeing you guys come back time after time. If you have any questions or if you have any feedback based on your own geomantic readings, please don't hesitate to let me know down in the comments. And I look forward to seeing you again very, very soon.